In this video, we're going to talk all about inspections. We're going to talk about what kind of inspections there are. We're going to talk about timelines for inspections. We're going to talk about what happens after inspections. All right, let's dig right into it. So for inspections, there are, let me make the screen a little bigger here. There are a few main inspections. There's other ones too that come in here and there. But the type of inspections here, we got the property inspection. So that's when you say the property inspection, that's kind of the general catch-all of an inspector coming out. It's kind of like the jack of all trades inspector coming out, looking at everything in the property. You also can do a radon inspection. Those aren't very common, especially in Indiana. They're not very common. In Illinois, they're a little more common. Lead-based paint inspections sometimes happen. They're pretty uncommon too. Pest inspection, that's usually like the termite inspections. Those are, depending on the house or if the location, those can be somewhat regular. Specialty inspections. So after a general inspector goes through a house, they'll often flag items as saying, hey, this item might not be up to snuff, but I'm not an expert at X, Y, or Z. So items that I see somewhat frequently asking that a general inspector asks for a specialty inspector to come out for would be like structural work for decks, fireplaces. Will often be a general inspector will also often ask for a fireplace specialist to come out and assess something if something doesn't look quite right to a general inspector. Sometimes electrical items will be asked for to be inspected by a specialty electrical, and sometimes roof too. Most of the time, these specialty inspections aren't needed, but sometimes you'll see this. Structural is another one on there that I didn't have on this list, and that one I see every now and then. Like if you'll see in a CMU foundation, like a CMU concrete masonry unit foundation, will there be some cracking or maybe a little bowing, that a general inspector will say, hey, that doesn't look right. It might be okay, but I need a structural engineer to come, or inspector to come out and check those out. So, all right, so let's look into, so now we're going to look at an actual inspection report, and let me go this full screen here. So we're going to look at an actual inspection report. Make myself a little smaller. And we'll talk through what was noted, and then we'll talk to also about what's okay to ask for and what's not okay. And really, when I say okay, it's like what's kind of standard. So a lot of times buyers will think that the seller is responsible to provide them a home that is up to code, and that is not correct. A seller doesn't really have to do anything. There could be something flagrantly wrong with the house, and the seller doesn't have to fix anything. There's kind of an understanding that the seller is responsible to provide a home that's like safe and operational. So anything beyond that is really beyond the scope of what an inspection is, like a buyer is really supposed to be asking for. But that's not always what happens. A lot of times buyers will ask for things above and beyond that, and then once requests are made, once an inspection is done, a inspector gives the buyer the report. Then the buyer will then generate a list of items that they're going to ask the seller to correct or improve. So we'll see some of these. So I picked a house here that had quite a few comments in the report, and we'll just go right through it, and we'll kind of see. So these reports come up with a table of contents for the different categories. I don't have to read them off, but you can see them here. Roof, garage, attic, bathroom, etc. You see the different lists here. All right. So now let's get right into some definitions. Starts off with general information, time, date, conditions, and we're going to get right into. So at the end of this will be a summary, and that's really where the nuts and bolts of the inspection is. But we'll go into the weeds on this a little bit so you can see what all an inspector looks at. So again, it's by category, and these inspectors use these applications that they buy that walk them through the property. So it's a standard process, and at the end it generates a report. So for this, they're taking a look at the driveway, and this house was built in like the 50s or something like that. So it's a little bit of an older house. So that some items like this are to be expected to be found. So they're noting here that there's some cracking, and he's recommending general maintenance. You'll see all kinds of disclaimers like this from every inspector saying general maintenance, or a specialist should look at this further. So something like this, it's an older property. You're not be surprised for a concrete crack to be there. So something like this would not really warrant a buyer to ask a seller to correct. If there was a big trip hazard, possibly, but cracks like this, the inspector's pointing them out. Here they're looking at the sidewalk to make sure it's flat and no trip hazards. So he's documenting the photos there. Here we see he's documenting patio stones uneven surface due to settling. Again, this is an older house, so this is something that's that a buyer really shouldn't ask for to be corrected, because it's just it's an older house, and stuff like this is going to be expected to see. Deck. Here there was a note about the risers are not in place. And, that's something that if a buyer asked for, that some sellers would address and some would. And some would say, hey, it's not, the deck works, I'm not going to add those. And some buyers would ask for them, and then that'd be an item that would just be negotiated. Here was something that this deck railing was loose, and that's something that's a safety item. So that would be something that I would see a buyer warranted to ask the seller to repair and make that safe. All right, so we get to grading here. They're saying that the grade, so the earth slopes back towards the house. And so that's something that, this house was sold in the winter time. So that's something that you really wouldn't correct at that time, because with the frozen ground and whatnot, you really can't do earthwork. So that's something that it's a pretty minor item that a buyer should just expect to add little dirt later on to correct that. Here there's an item about trees being too close to the foundation, and this is something that a buyer might be warranted to ask for them to be removed, because these at some time could cause foundation damage. But most sellers would not agree to remove these, because it's an open obvious thing with the house. All right, so yeah, just more of that. All right, basement stairwell. Yeah, here we go. We're seeing. He's recommending a proper railing. So he's saying, hey, something doesn't look right to me, but I'm not an expert, so I'm recommending a qualified expert comes out and looks at this. So you'll see stuff like that peppered throughout the report. All right. This is a drain at the bottom here. He's just saying that it needs to be clear, which makes sense. There's no real comment there. Just calling out some holes in the siding there. That's something, those are pretty minor that, a buyer could really just put some caulk in those holes. Because if a buyer asks for everything on a report to get repaired, it would usually upset a seller, because it would be a lot of small items that they could just take care of. When you're buying an older house, you have to remember that there's going to be odds and ends around the house that, might need a little love. And again, the seller's not responsible to provide a house that's, up to code and in perfect condition. So that's always the balance, is like safety and functionality versus, a brand new house. We're somewhere in between there on what the expectation is. All right, here we're going to get into a lot of those, usually always electrical comments, especially the GFCIs do or don't work. And so you'll see that that's something that sellers generally are responsible for and are willing to repair, is to have those, make sure that those are properly wired and properly tripping. All right, here's they're talking about the roof. The inspector's saying that you couldn't inspect part of it because it was covered with snow. And so in this scenario, an inspector just does the best they can. From what they see, they generally say, hey, if I can see the roof in bits and pieces, it's my guess that the rest of it's in similar condition. And then they just put a disclaimer on there that said they couldn't see the entire thing. So in this home, there was no roof issues, as this one was a pretty good condition. All right, moving on to just some maintenance items. You'll see this a lot too, that inspectors will call out for drains to be moved further away from foundations. That's kind of a common request, and that's kind of sometimes it's a little challenge, because if you run it out to the yard, then you have a trip hazard or a obstacle to cut grass around. So it's a little bit balanced. You do want to make sure your water's not going right out towards your foundation, because that's not good. But that's one of the things too, where it's like, hey, it's an older house, and yeah, okay. So we're gonna go to rear garage. It's talking about there some panels that have some damage to them, and this is something that it's an older house, and so it would be kind of uncommon for a buyer to expect a seller to fix panels that just have a little cracking to them. All right, here, health and safety. This is one where these cables did not have a safety cable to them, or the springs, and that's something that the seller should put on there, because that's a safety item. And again, sometimes sellers would just say, no, hey, I'm not going to do that, I don't have to. Generally, a seller would do something like that. It's a pretty easy repair, and in the next case they did. Almost all inspections I see, they have language about the electric motors not being calibrated properly, that they're either put too much force up or down, and that's something that's usually just really easily adjustable. All right, let's move into just going through garage inspection here. Foundation, there's looking at some cracks there. Electrical, he's calling out more GFCI issues. This fixture is missing a pull chain. That's something that a seller would generally be expected to correct, because that's just not functional. Something like this, a missing part of a window, that goes to functionality and security of the home. So getting that fixed would be something expected of a seller. Again, we're calling out drainage extensions here. All right, attic. So this is the attic of the house. The inspector crawls around as much as they can and checks for mold and water damage, and they check the level of insulation too. What was his comments here? Maintenance, ventilation, roof vents, recommend baffles for soffit vents. Yeah, on this one there was a couple vents, like the bathroom and the kitchen vented into the attic and didn't go all the way outside. And that's something that I see about half the sellers will actually do the work to extend them outside. Half will say, no, we're not willing to do that. And that's just something that gets negotiated. Yeah, we'll see here, like this attic fan. There's some things that can't be tested in the cold weather, and this is one of those. Air conditioning systems really can't be tested either in the wintertime. All right, just talking about some exposed wiring here. Exposed wiring is something that a seller would be expected generally to repair. This was one that was interesting, that they noted some mold. And so in this scenario, in this house, the buyer asked the seller to have the mold remediated, and a certificate of remediation provided by a certified mold contractor, and they did do that. This was just some moisture was noted along the roof line. Couldn't really tell what the timeline was on when the moisture got there. So there was no action item that was done on this one. This was an item, windows. The comment here was that this is like an older glass window by a tub, and so if this breaks, it breaks into shards and could be dangerous. The buyer asked the seller to replace this one, and the seller declined, which would be pretty common. Unless there was a window broken, it would be very uncommon for a seller to replace a window just because somebody wanted something newer that had more safety features than something that was older. All right, this tub had a missing handle. The faucet did, and so that was something that to be obviously. Oh yeah, it came off here. You can see the handle here, and this is something that the seller did have repaired, and the seller would generally be expected to be repaired. This item was just saying that there's a flexible line here, and this inspector didn't recommend that being good. That they wanted a solid wall, but the buyer didn't have any issue with that, so they just didn't comment on it. Here's more GFCI comments. All right, here the inspector is just calling out that there's not a beta caulk here, and recommend that that this does get caulked. The buyer didn't ask for that. That'd be something generally unexpected for a seller to remedy. Okay, we talked about this already, that this kitchen vents into the attic and not to outside. So the buyer did ask the seller to extend this outside, and so they did. And part of that too was that because there was mold in the attic, I believe that was part of the seller's motivation to do some of these things that you would, because oftentimes I'll see a buyer ask for a seller to extend a vent from the attic to outside and they'll decline. But in this one, there was that little bit of mold. So it seemed to be that was a motivation for these sellers to vent to outside. Here, just got a note about a hinge on a door. This is here they're saying the faucet is loose and needs to be tightened. The buyer didn't comment about that, didn't ask for anything to be done. There's just some loose hardware here. The buyer didn't ask for it. That'd be generally unexpected to ask for that. Dryer vent here. This was something where the inspector called out that the back of the dryer vent going up was plastic, and that for safety issues that shouldn't be plastic. That should be let's see what they say. Fire as a replacement with approved type dryer vent. Yeah, basically. So a non-plastic, whatever the metal material is. And the buyer did ask the seller to do that, and the seller agreed to replace that. Here we had a trip hazard on the threshold. This threshold was pretty high. It's like a transition piece from the flooring to the stair material, and that was probably like 1 inch high. So they did replace that with a lower profile one, of which I did trip over that, so and so did the inspector. All right, smoke detector. You'll see general comments about that. Usually that's something that buyers won't ask for a seller to remedy if there's something wrong with them, because they're pretty cheap just to go and buy new smoke detectors for a home. All right, here there's some electrical items noted with the panel, and one of the issues too is that the panel couldn't come off because the trim was too close around it. So that was something that the buyer did ask the seller to remedy, to get to adjust the trim so that the panel could come off for inspection. So they did take care of that, and that would be something generally expected of the seller to remedy. This comment here was that the breaker for the AC unit was oversized for what the power draw of the AC unit was, and that's something the buyer asked for and the seller did remedy. Usually I would see something that a seller may or may not address that. Here, hot water tank. Yeah, in the hot water line, there was no shutoff to it, so that was something the buyer asked for and the seller agreed to. Generally, that'd be something that a seller would be expected to provide. There's shutoffs on the water lines. All right, we got that was a minor item. Yeah, AC. You'll see here it wasn't tested because when you turn an air conditioner on in the winter, it can damage the compressor, and so in the wintertime, AC units aren't tested. On some houses where the AC units are old and it's unclear as to if they work or not, what I've seen buyers do is that you could ask the seller to provide a warranty, and it'd be like a 1-year warranty. It usually runs about $700. There's different levels of warranties, but the ones that actually cover something are usually at about $700 price point, and that would provide coverage for appliances. All right. Heating system. Yeah, there weren't really any comments on this. All right, freestanding stove. This was one that, yeah, the inspector had some comments on it that said there was some gaps, needed to be cleaned, and cleaned by a qualified contractor. And that's something, this item, the buyer did ask the seller to have a certified fireplace contractor inspect and do maintenance on this unit, and the sellers declined to do that. They just said that that was maintenance work and they weren't interested in doing it. So that's how that one got negotiated. Basement. Yeah, there's a note here we're talking about on the basement level. It said like unable to inspect 90% of the structure, because they're talking about the structure here. The structure is not visible due to remodeling, and so this is the inspector's way of saying, hey, I couldn't look at the foundation in the basement because it was finished. So that's like disclaimer language. That's pretty common, because an inspector all he can inspect is what he can see, and then some light testing he can do, like with the electrical test probes to make sure that the wiring is correct. All right, we got into sump pump. Yeah, this was pretty interesting. That this sump pump is in a poor location. Recommend installing a doorway behind the washer and dryer for maintenance. So yeah, so this was just that the sump pump was kind of built into behind the wall, and so it was a pretty precarious position for that thing to be in, like if you ever had to do maintenance. But there really wasn't a remedy for this one, so that was just left as it was. Yeah, so he just made a note here, like due to the location, he couldn't test it. Okay, lots and grounds, tree. Oh, is this the summary? Yeah, so this is the summary. This report always says marginal. I'm not sure what the word marginal is used. But yeah, so this is the summary. So a lot of this we already went through. Yeah, we went through all that. So again, the summary is where the major items are listed. We got all those. So then what happens next is that, so the inspector provides this report to the buyer, and then the buyer has to make the list of items that they want the seller to address, or at least to ask them to. And again, the seller doesn't have to comply with these requests, and they're usually, some negotiation of this. Sometimes there's no comments, sometimes there's just a few, and then the seller will just take care of them. I've seen some where the house was really good condition and the buyer asked for some things that would generally, the seller would not be expected to take care of, but there was just a few minor items, so that I'm sure the sellers just said, hey, this is, a couple $100 to take care of it, so let's just do it and get this deal done. So, all right, so what happens next? So after the inspection comes, the buyer gets the report, and then they usually confer with their agent on what's the kind of things they should ask for, so this is in Illinois, is that the comments go back to the buyer's attorney to put on a letter and send to the seller's attorney and their seller's side. That's this letter that will go through. And then in Indiana, we just have attorneys generally aren't used, and we have these standard forms that we send to the seller side. So we'll look at this one. So this is the letter of the requests for work repairs that was made. And so we had so they asked for the deck railing was loose and need to be secured, and then the deck risers need to be secured by a licensed contractor. The bathroom window should be replaced with safety glass window was the request there. Again, the seller did not comply with that one. Item 3, the mold in the attic should be professionally remediated and certification of remediation provided. The seller did take care of that one. 4, oven vents into attic and needs to be corrected to vent to the outside of the home. The seller did take care of those. 5 was the electrical comments on the GFCI and then that air conditioning breaker. The seller did take care of those items. 6, the garage door is missing the cables and the springs, which should be professionally installed by a qualified contractor. So the seller did take care of that item. 7, the bathtub handle is broken, should be repaired. And the water service, the water heater needs a shutoff valve, and a couple other items. The seller did take care of those. 8, the plastic dryer vent should be replaced with the metal dryer vent. And that one, actually, the seller did take care of, but they misunderstood what our request was, and they replaced a different item, which was no big deal to the buyer, because we found that out the day before at the final walkthrough that they replaced the wrong part. But to the buyer, it wasn't a big deal. It was probably a $5 part to replace on their own. Number 9, the threshold at the front door is too high, causing a tripping hazard, need to be lowered. So the seller did have that replaced with the lower one. 10 was the fireplace needs to be cleaned and inspected by a fireplace professional. So that one the seller did decline. And so, again, this is the letter that goes from the buyer's attorney to the selling side, and then the selling side reviews this letter, and then they send back a letter saying what they do agree or don't agree to. And in Illinois, what usually happens is that the seller's attorney will actually just write on here, like say, agreed, not agreed, or something like that. And then that kind of goes back and forth until both parties agree, and then they will sign off on it, like here. So at the end of the negotiations, you'll have the seller's attorney and the buyer's attorney both having signed off on one of these inspection reports, or one of these letters. And then so in Indiana, the realtors directly just prepare the comments from the buyer. You have these standard forms like the buyer's inspection response number 1, and that goes to, so we'll just list out the exact items that we're requesting the seller to remedy, and then the seller will then, or the seller's agent will then reply on our response form. The form looks very similar to this, and it will say what they will or what they won't remedy. And so we won't go into details on this one, but just to show the form. Yeah, so again, and then in Indiana, once, there might be a little back and forth in the negotiation, but then both the buyer and the seller sign off on it. So then that's the agreement. So that will lock up the agreements of what's going to be expected on repairs by the seller. And then so the seller has the time, up to closing to make those repairs. If you wanted to have a milestone of when it needs to be done, that could be added into the inspection comments too. So the seller makes the repairs, and then the buyer, both these letters in Illinois and Indiana give the buyer the right to inspect the work again. So the work that they asked to be done that the seller takes care of, then the buyer has opportunity to inspect those again before they close on the house. And usually if it's just smaller items, then we'll just look at it like the day before or early that day at the final walkthrough. And I have had it sometimes where some work was not done, and then what will happen is that the buyer could decide just not to close until they're done, until those items are done, or so I haven't had that scenario happen where the buyer said, no, I'm not closing till it's done. But what usually happens at that point is that if something was not corrected that a seller agreed to, that at closing they would give the buyer a credit to have that work done. So if it was, a $300 plumbing repair, that the seller would then just credit the buyer $300 to have that work done. So that is the inspection process. A couple hoops that sometimes have to be jumped through is when these inspection repairs are made. You have to, if you look at them again, you then either, some of them are obvious that you can just see that they were done. Some items like the mold that was remedied on this house, you'd want to have a certificate from a mold company saying that it was properly remedied, because by the eye, if you're looking at it yourself, if you're not a mold expert, you wouldn't know if it was done correctly. And electrical repairs are kind of like that too. So in your final inspections or in your final walkthrough, you could have your inspector go through again and to confirm those items were corrected properly. So that's inspections in a nutshell. Thanks.